am your host, Miss Marple. Welcome to my channel, Sherlock Midnight Echo. Remember,
The village of Little Paddocks, draped in an unusually heavy December frost, had gathered at the old Victorian estate of Starmount to witness the unveiling of Lord Arthur Stirling's restored celestial observatory. Beneath the grand iron dome, warmth emanated from roaring braziers, and the scent of spiced cider mingled with the faint, sharp tang of brass polish and aged paper. Among the guests, knitting serenely near a potted fern, sat Miss Jane Marple. She wore her familiar fluffy pink wool shawl, her blue eyes mild and watery, appearing to all the world like a harmless old lady lost in thoughts of pearl stitches and village gossip. Yet behind that gentle facade, Miss Marple was quietly taking inventory. Human nature in Little Paddocks, she had long ago concluded, was remarkably similar to human nature in St. Mary Mead, or, for that matter, anywhere else on earth. Lord Arthur, an eccentric amateur astronomer with a penchant for dramatics, stood on the brass podium beside the grand brass telescope. "Tonight, my dear friends," Lord Arthur proclaimed, his voice echoing against the domed ceiling, "we look not merely at the heavens, but into the future. To mark this occasion, I have made a slight alteration to my grand estate trust." A subtle chill, entirely unrelated to the winter air, rippled through the gathered crowd. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for a fraction of a second. She observed the sudden stillness of Lord Arthur's young nephew, Julian, whose knuckles turned white around his glass of champagne. She caught the brief, sharp look exchanged between Lady Eleanor, Arthur's frosty elder sister, and Mr. Thomas Vance, the family solicitor, who stood clutching a heavy leather briefcase. The details," Lord Arthur continued, enjoying the tense silence, "will be revealed when the clock strikes midnight. But I assure you, justice shall finally be served." He stepped down from the podium and retired up the spiral staircase into the upper observation gallery to make final adjustments to the telescope before midnight. The guests dispersed into hushed, uneasy clusters. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind drawing a mental parallel to old Mrs. Badger, who had once threatened to alter her will regarding her nephew's choir boy allowance, leading to the mysterious, albeit temporary, disappearance of her prize-winning Persian cat. Money and sudden grand declarations, Miss Marple reflected, invariably brought out the worst in people. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 11:45, then 11:45. As the hands touched the hour of midnight, a deep, resonant chime echoed through the observatory. "Arthur," Lady Eleanor called out, her sharp voice cutting through the soft hum of conversation. "It is midnight. Stop playing the theatrical host and come down." There was no answer from the upper gallery. Julian chuckled nervously. "Uncle Arthur loves his dramatic pauses. He's probably waiting for us to applaud." After another moment of heavy silence, Thomas Vance sighed, setting his briefcase on a mahogany table. "I shall fetch him. The man is nearly 70. These stairs are hardly suitable for midnight antics." The solicitor ascended the cast-iron spiral staircase, his polished shoes clinking against the metal steps. The guests below watched in expectant silence. They saw Mr. Vance reach the top platform, step into the shadows of the upper viewing deck, and stop dead. A sudden, sharp gasp escaped the solicitor's lips. "Arthur?" Vance's voice trembled, stripped entirely of its professional composure. "Arthur? Good God!" A low murmur broke out among the guests. Lady Eleanor stepped forward, her face pale. "Thomas, what is it?" Vance backed away from the upper deck railing, his face ashen in the dim light of the braziers. "Call the police, immediately." Julian rushed up the stairs, brushing past the shaken solicitor. A second later, a smothered cry echoed from the gallery. Dr. Haydock, the local practitioner who happened to be attending as a guest, pushed his way through the crowd and scrambled up the iron steps. Miss Marple gently set her knitting ball into her embroidered work bag, adjusted her lace cap, and followed at a slow, deliberate pace, keeping close to the shadows of the staircase. On the upper platform, bathed in the pale, cold moonlight streaming down through the open glass dome, lay Lord Arthur Stirling. He was slumped beside his beloved brass telescope. Protruding from his chest was a heavy, antique brass plumb bob, a heavy astronomical tool used for aligning the instrument, its weighted tip driven deep through his velvet dinner jacket. Dr. Whodunit knelt beside the fallen host, pressed 2 fingers to the cold neck, and slowly shook his head. He's gone, stabbed through the heart. Death was nearly instantaneous. The observatory below erupted into chaos. Shrieks of horror, frantic voices, and the hurried shuffling of feet. Miss Marple did not scream. She stood quietly at the edge of the upper gallery, her blue eyes sweeping the scene with meticulous precision. She noted the angle of the fallen body, the position of the heavy velvet curtains framing the viewing slit, and the faint melting trace of snow near the foot of the telescope stand. Snow that had somehow bypassed the open dome above. A terrible crime had been committed in the high, cold towers of Starmount. And as the distant sound of police sirens began to wail across the frozen fields of little paddocks, Miss Marple quietly folded her hands, knowing that among the shocked faces below masked a ruthless killer. The snow began to fall in earnest outside Starmount Estate, blanketing the manicured gardens of little paddocks in a muffled, heavy white. Inside the Victorian Observatory, the air had turned brittle. The body of Lord Arthur Stirling remained upstairs under the watchful, solemn eye of Dr. Whodunit, while the guests were shepherded down into the grand drawing-room by Inspector Slack, who had arrived with 3 shivering constables. Inspector Slack was a man who believed implicitly in system, speed, and suspecting the most obvious person as quickly as possible. He stood before the roaring fireplace, his notebook open, his pencil hovering like a hawk over a field mouse. "Now then," Slack barked, his eyes darting across the gathered villagers. "We have a locked property, a dead host, and an hour of the night where nobody claims to have seen a thing. But crimes do not commit themselves, do they? Someone in this room held that heavy brass instrument." Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in a winged armchair near the corner, her fingers working rhythmically on a slate-blue wool sock. To any casual observer, she was merely an elderly lady seeking comfort in a familiar habit amid tragedy. In truth, Miss Marple was listening with the sharp, ruthless efficiency of a hawk disguised as a sparrow. "It's daylight robbery, that's what it is," declared Mrs. Clara Bantry, a prominent local figure known equally for her prized dahlias and her tendency to jump to immediate conclusions. She leaned toward Miss Marple, whispering loudly enough to carry across the room. "I said to Arthur only last Tuesday. I said, 'Arthur, you hire those local boys from the village to polish the brass, and mark my words, one of them has a criminal brow.' You remember young Fred Higgs? Stole 2 apples from the rectory in '38. It's the lower classes taking advantage of a peer's generosity, Jane. Mark my words." Miss Marple gave a soft, sympathetic sigh, her needles clicking gently. "Oh, Clara dear, young Fred is married now and living in Sussex with 3 lovely children. He runs a very respectable butcher shop. It reminds me so much of poor Mr. Henderson's nephew, you know. Everyone thought he had taken the parish funds because he wore his cap at an angle, but it turned out to be the churchwarden all along, who was secretly betting on greyhounds. That is quite enough village history, ladies," Inspector Slack snapped, glaring over his notebook. "We are dealing with murder, not greyhounds. Now, Mr. Julian Stirling." Julian, Lord Arthur's nephew, straightened up from the sideboard where he had been pouring himself a liberal measure of brandy. His hand shook slightly, splashing the amber liquid onto the polished mahogany. "Yes, Inspector. Your uncle announced a change to his trust just minutes before his death," Slack said, stepping closer. "A change that seemed to upset you considerably. You turned white as a sheet, according to 3 witnesses. I was surprised, not upset," Julian said quickly, his voice tight. "Uncle Arthur was prone to grand theatrical gestures. He loved keeping us all on edge. Ask anyone here. He's threatened to rewrite his trust 6 times this year alone. Once he threatened to leave the entire estate to a donkey sanctuary in Devon because he was annoyed with the parish council. Be that as it may," Slack replied with a grim smile, "you are his primary heir, or you were, until tonight. If he signed a new document before he died, you stand to lose Starmount entirely. If he died before signing it, you inherit everything." "That is a monstrous insinuation," cried Lady Eleanor, rising from her chair with rigid dignity. Her spine was straight as a poker, her cold grey eyes flashing with aristocratic fury. "My nephew may be a bit of a spendthrift, Inspector, but he is a Stirling. We do not go about stabbing our relatives with astronomical tools. Family loyalty is very touching, Lady Eleanor, Slack said smoothly. But facts are facts. Mr. Julian was seen going up the spiral staircase shortly after the solicitor, Mr. Vance. I went up because Vance gasped, Julian shouted, setting his glass down with a hard thud. I thought my uncle had collapsed from a heart attack. When I reached the top, he was already dead. I didn't touch him. I didn't touch the plumb bob, and I certainly didn't kill him. In the corner, Miss Marple lowered her knitting to her lap. She looked at Julian's agitated face, then shifted her gaze to Mr. Thomas Vance, the solicitor. Vance was sitting very still, his arms crossed tightly over his heavy leather briefcase, which rested on his knees like a shield. His breathing was shallow, his lips pressed into a thin, tight line. It's extraordinary, Miss Marple murmured softly to herself, though her voice caught the ear of Miss Emily Hargreaves, the vicar's sister, sitting beside her. What is extraordinary, Jane? Emily whispered, clutching her handkerchief. The way dear Julian reminds me of young Raymond West when he lost his bicycle, Miss Marple replied innocently. When people are truly guilty, Emily, they usually try very hard to look calm and helpful. When they are innocent, they tend to make a terrible fuss and say all the wrong things out of sheer temper. Just like poor Raymond when he accused the coalman of stealing his pump, when he had simply left it behind the tool shed himself. Are you saying Julian is innocent? Emily asked, blinking. I am merely observing, Miss Marple said gently, taking up her wool once more. Human nature is so remarkably consistent. Look at Mr. Vance, for instance. He has not let go of that leather bag since he came down those stairs. A man who has just found his oldest client murdered usually drops things or wrings his hands. He does not hold on to his paperwork as if it were a life preserver. Meanwhile, Inspector Slack was warming to his theory. Mr. Vance, he called out. The document Lord Arthur mentioned, where is it? Vance cleared his throat, his professional demeanor slipping back into place like a mask. Lord Arthur had requested a draft, Inspector. It was in my briefcase. However, it was never executed. It requires 2 witnesses and a formal signature. As it stands, the old trust remains legally binding. Mr. Julian Sterling remains the sole beneficiary. Slack crossed his arms, looking thoroughly pleased with himself. So, if the murder happened before the new trust could be signed, the nephew has everything to gain and everything to lose if he waited another hour. A classic motive. It's absurd, Julian protested, though his voice cracked under the strain. Miss Marple watched the drama unfold with a quiet, sorrowful pity. Inspector Slack was so eager to fit the pieces into a neat, obvious puzzle that he was completely blind to the pattern of the wood. She looked past the shouting nephew and the smug inspector, her mind drifting back to the cold, moonlit gallery upstairs, to the heavy velvet curtains, the tiny patch of melting snow on the clean floor, and the strange, quiet tension that had hung over Starmount long before the clock had struck midnight. The heavy oak doors of the drawing-room swung open, admitting a gust of icy air as Inspector Slack bustled out to oversee the arrival of the forensic photographer from the county town. Taking immediate advantage of the momentary lull, Miss Jane Marple slipped unobserved through the side hallway and ascended the dark rear service stairs that led up toward the dome. Her soft wool slippers made no sound against the worn stone steps. She stepped into the upper observation gallery, where the bitter night air blew through the open viewing slit in the iron ceiling. Dr. Haydock was kneeling beside the body, placing his instruments back into his black leather bag. Jane? Haydock turned, startled, his eyebrows rising beneath his silver hair. You shouldn't be up here. Slack will have a fit if he catches you disturbing a crime scene. Dear Dr. Haydock, Miss Marple said with a gentle, disarming smile, wrapping her pink shawl more tightly around her shoulders. Inspector Slack is currently down in the hall instructing young Constable Hicks on how to proper lock the scullery door. I shall only be a moment. Poor Arthur. It is all so very dreadful. She approached the heavy brass telescope, her sharp, watery blue eyes moving methodically over the cold floorboards. The body of Lord Arthur lay still, bathed in the pale beam of a battery-operated lantern. Death was instant, I suppose? She asked softly. Virtually, Haydock replied, rising and brushing off his trousers. The heavy brass plumb bob penetrated the left ventricle. driven in with considerable force, Jane. A strong arm, or perhaps a sudden, desperate thrust. A strong arm, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Yes, like young Willie Higgins when he hurled the heavy iron anvil at the blacksmith's apprentice back in 12. Everyone thought poor Willie had a terrible temper, but it turned out he was merely trying to knock down a hive of wild bees that was swarming near his sister. Haydock smiled faintly, accustomed to her odd village parallels. I doubt bees had anything to do with this, Jane. No, indeed, Miss Marple murmured. She was not looking at the body now, but at the polished mahogany floorboards surrounding the base of the grand telescope. She knelt with surprising agility for a woman of her years, her lace-trimmed hem resting on the dust. Her gaze fixed upon a small, isolated patch of moisture near the central brass pillar, a faint, melting trace of snow. She reached out a delicate finger, touching the drop of water, then looked directly up at the open viewing slit of the observatory dome above. The aperture was aligned toward the southern horizon, yet the snow falling outside was coming down thick and straight, driven by an easterly wind that blew across the northern face of the estate. How very curious, she whispered to herself. What is curious, Jane? Haydock asked, leaning over her shoulder. The snow, Doctor, Miss Marple said, pointing her frail finger at the tiny puddle. If the dome was opened only just before midnight, as Lord Arthur proclaimed, the snow on the floor beneath the aperture should be scattered in a wide spray by the wind. Yet here, a good 3 feet to the left of the opening, is a single, concentrated cluster of melting flakes, almost as though it had fallen off someone's boots. Or perhaps, she paused, her eyes widening slightly as she looked toward the thick velvet curtains that lined the perimeter of the gallery. She rose slowly and walked over to the heavy crimson drapery. Gathering the heavy velvet in her hand, she examined the hem. A faint, wet tide mark stained the fabric near the floor, where snow had melted into the heavy weave. Someone was standing behind these curtains, Miss Marple said softly. Long before Lord Arthur ever made his speech from the podium downstairs, a hidden watcher. Haydock frowned. Or the killer waiting in ambush. Or perhaps, Miss Marple replied, her voice dropping to a thoughtful hush, someone who came in from the garden through the upper terrace door. She pointed to a small, low oak door set into the curving wall of the observatory, which led out to the narrow stone balustrade surrounding the exterior of the dome. She stepped toward the door and turned the iron latch. It opened with a soft groan, revealing the howling white winter night outside. The stone terrace was blanketed in 2 inches of fresh snow. Miss Marple did not step out into the freezing cold, but she leaned forward, her sharp eyes scanning the pristine surface. Near the threshold, partially filled by the fresh snowfall, were 2 distinct, elongated impressions in the drift. Not footprints, she murmured, her mind whirring with memories of St. Mary Mead. No, those are the marks of a ladder, the very same sort of marks old Mr. Finch left in the vicarage flower beds when he was secretly fixing the guttering after dark so his wife wouldn't know he was working late. Jane, what are you muttering about? Haydock asked, stepping up behind her. I am thinking of human nature, Doctor, Miss Marple said, turning back into the warmth of the gallery with a bright, cheerful look in her eyes, and how people so often do things in the most roundabout way possible when a straight path is right before them. Inspector Slack thinks dear Julian came up those spiral stairs in a rage of greed. But a man who wishes to murder his uncle for money does not usually leave a wet ladder against the terrace railing when there is a perfectly good staircase inside. You think someone came from the outside? I think, Doctor, Miss Marple said, carefully pulling her pink shawl back over her elbows, that several people were playing very different games in this observatory tonight, and poor Lord Arthur's dramatic announcement merely interrupted a tragedy that was already well underway. Before Haydock could respond, the heavy tread of Inspector Slack's boots echoed up the iron spiral staircase, accompanied by the loud, authoritative cough of a man who believed he was about to solve a crime. Miss Marple quickly stepped back into the shadows of the velvet drapery, her fingers resuming their gentle, innocent clasp over her embroidered handbag, her face settling into a picture of vague, bewildered old age. Inspector Slack marched into the gallery with the triumphant air of a commander who had already secured his victory. Behind him trailed Constable Hicks, carrying a thick pad of official report paper. Slack stopped beside the body, thrust his hands into his raincoat pockets, and fixed Dr. Haydock with a stern, authoritative stare. "Well, Doctor?" Slack demanded, his voice echoing off the iron dome. "I trust you've finished with the preliminary examination. The county photographer is ready to take his plates, and then we can have the deceased removed to the mortuary." "Everything is in order, Inspector." Dr. Haydock said mildly, glancing briefly toward the shadows near the velvet curtains where Miss Marple stood, looking entirely like a forgotten piece of antique furniture. Death was caused by the penetration of the heavy brass plumb bob into the heart. Time of death was extremely recent, certainly within 20 minutes of my arriving at the body. Right around midnight. Right when the clock struck, Slack said, nodding with grim satisfaction. "Just as I thought. A crime of opportunity and desperation." He turned toward the iron spiral staircase and gestured for Hicks to step forward. "Bring up young Sterling, Hicks. Let's see how he accounts for himself in the presence of his victim." "Is that entirely necessary, Inspector?" Haydock asked, frowning. "The young man is severely shaken. In my experience, Doctor, shaken men make bloody mistakes," Slack declared, slapping his notebook against his palm. "And Mr. Julian Sterling has every reason to be shaken." A moment later, Julian Sterling was led up the stairs by Constable Hicks. His hair was disheveled, his dinner jacket slightly askew, and the high collar of his shirt unbuttoned at the throat. He kept his eyes averted from the still form on the floor, staring instead at the gleaming brass barrel of the grand telescope. "Now then, Mr. Sterling," Slack began, stepping into Julian's line of sight. "Let us lay out the facts simple and plain. You are heavily in debt. Don't bother denying it. My constable has already spoken to the local postmaster, who mentions a great deal of registered mail arriving for you from moneylenders in London." Julian's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. "My private financial affairs are hardly relevant to a murder investigation, Inspector. They are exceedingly relevant when your wealthy uncle stands on a podium, announces he is altering his estate trust to serve justice, and 20 minutes later ends up with a piece of brass in his heart." Slack countered smoothly. "You were seen ascending these stairs immediately after Mr. Vance." "I told you downstairs, and I shall tell you again," Julian snapped, his knuckles white as he clenched his fists. "I heard Vance gasp. I ran up to see what was wrong. Vance was standing right where you are now, frozen in terror. I stepped past him, saw Uncle Arthur on the floor, and called out to the room below. That was all. And yet," Slack said, leaning forward with a hawk-like grin, "Mr. Vance claims he was at least 10 paces behind you when you reached the top of the stairs. He says you rushed up ahead of him during the midnight chimes, before anyone had realized anything was wrong." Julian gasped, stepping back. "Vance said what asterisk? That is a downright lie. Vance went up first. He announced he was fetching my uncle." From the dark sanctuary of the velvet curtains, Miss Marple watched the young man's expression. She noted the genuine horror in his eyes, not the calculated panic of a trapped liar, but the wild, bewildered shock of a man suddenly caught in a net he had not seen being cast. It reminded her precisely of young Dickie Town, the curate's nephew in St. Mary Mead, who had been accused of breaking the stained glass window in the transept simply because he had been found standing near the catapult, while the actual culprit, the churchwarden's mischievous youngest boy, had been quietly slipping out through the vestry door. "It is a question of word against word, Mr. Sterling," Slack said, crossing his arms. "And Mr. Vance is a respected solicitor of 30 years' standing. You, on the other hand, have 3 overdue notices from bookmakers in your coat pocket, which I shall be requiring you to surrender presently." "This is a frame-up," Julian shouted, turning desperately toward Dr. Haydock. "Doctor, you know me. I am a fool with my allowance, I admit it, but I loved my uncle. He was eccentric, yes, but he was good to me." "Inspector, Doctor," Haydock interjected cautiously. "The young man's distress seems entirely genuine. Perhaps we ought not to rush to conclusions before the forensic team." "I never rush, Dr. Haydock," Slack interrupted frostily. "I follow the evidence. The suspect had the motive, a multi-thousand-pound inheritance hanging in the balance. He had the opportunity, rushing up these stairs in the dark while the rest of the guests were looking at the clock. And he has no alibi for the crucial 3 minutes between 11:57 and midnight." I was standing by the punch bowl, Julian pleaded. With Lady Eleanor. Lady Eleanor was across the room talking to the vicar's sister, Slack replied dryly. She has already admitted she lost sight of you in the crowd. Miss Marple gave a tiny, almost imperceptible sigh, her wool sock shifting slightly beneath her shawl. Inspector Slack was building a most tidy, sensible house out of blocks, but he was building it entirely on the wrong foundation. He saw only the obvious path, the angry heir, the debt, the altered will. He did not see the subtle, quiet web of human vanity and fear that wove through the rest of the room. She looked past the arguing men toward the small oak door leading out to the snowy terrace. Her eyes lingered on the latch, where a single dark thread of Harris tweed, a coarse, high-quality woolen fabric, hung caught in the rough iron fitting. It was not from Julian's refined Berathea dinner suit, nor was it from the cheap serge of Constable Hicks's uniform. "Constable," Slack ordered, turning to Hicks with an air of finality. "Escort Mr. Sterling down to the morning room. Keep him under guard until the patrol car arrives from county headquarters. He is under arrest on suspicion of willful murder." "You're making a terrible mistake," Julian cried as Hicks took his arm. "A terrible mistake." As they led the shouting young man away, Inspector Slack dusted his hands together, looking thoroughly satisfied. "Well, Doctor," he said, turning to Haydock, "that solves the heavy lifting. A quick arrest keeps the village quiet. Now we just neat up the paperwork." Miss Marple stepped gently out from behind the velvet curtain, her face a picture of mild, fluttering sympathy. "Oh, Inspector," she cooed softly, "how wonderfully fast you work. Just like dear Mr. Inspector Stubbs back home. Though, of course, he did arrest the wrong milkman once, poor man. But the intention was so very noble." The heavy footsteps of Constable Hicks and the echoing protests of Julian Sterling died away down the spiral staircase, leaving the drafty observatory in an uneasy silence. Inspector Slack strutted toward the telescope, his boots squeaking on the brass floor plates. "A simple case, really," Slack remarked to Dr. Haydock, puffing out his chest. "Motive, access, temper. It's always the reckless young men who think they can outsmart the law." Miss Marple lingered near the perimeter of the room, her small frame almost swallowing itself within her pink wool shawl. Her eyes remained wide, innocent, and faintly bewildered, like an elderly duck contemplating a puddle. "Oh, Inspector, it is all so terribly clever of you," Miss Marple said softly, stepping closer with a delicate, tottering gait. "Speed is so comforting in these ghastly matters. Though I must ask, purely out of foolish curiosity, of course, did poor Lord Arthur always leave his brass lens cap on the secondary eyepiece when observing the stars?" Inspector Slack frowned, glancing down at the instrument. "The lens cap? What on earth does that have to do with anything, Miss Marple?" "Well, nothing at all, I am sure," she murmured, her delicate hands fluttering near her brooch. "It only struck me as rather peculiar. You see, my nephew Raymond once bought a very grand pair of binoculars for bird-watching in Hampshire. He told me that one asterisk never leaves the cover on the eyepiece while preparing to make an observation. Yet Lord Arthur, who was so very meticulous about his beloved telescope, seems to have set it all up for his midnight viewing without actually taking the lens brasses off at all. The man was murdered before he could finish his preparations, obviously," Slack said dismissively, flicking a thumb at his notebook. "Yes, of course. How stupid of me," Miss Marple agreed meekly. "Though, if he had not yet finished preparing the telescope, why was the heavy brass plumb bob lying on his work table rather than suspended from the alignment socket beneath the central pillar? It was always kept fitted, you see. I noticed it quite clearly when Lord Arthur showed me the apparatus during the summer garden fete." Dr. Haydock took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he looked from the brass instrument to the small, delicate woman. "She's right, Slack. The plumb bob isn't an executioner's weapon kept in a drawer. It's an integral measuring component. It ought to have been screwed tightly into the frame," Inspector Slack scoffed, though a flicker of irritation crossed his brow. The killer snatched it up off the table. "It doesn't alter the facts against young Sterling." No, I am sure it doesn't," Miss Marple said in a comforting tone. "Just a silly old woman's rambling. It only reminded me so much of poor Mr. Crump, the village baker. He was found with flour all over his Sunday jacket, and everyone thought he had been working late at the oven, but it turned out to be dry whitewash from the church wall where he had been hiding his lottery tickets. She drifted away from the central dais, her attention seemingly wandering toward the heavy mahogany desk set against the curved wall. On its polished surface sat an array of star charts, a fountain pen, and a small silver tray containing a single unlit beeswax candle and a box of safety matches. Miss Marple paused beside the tray. Her sharp, watery blue eyes caught a tiny, overlooked anomaly that lay nestled in the groove of the silver rim, a small, dark cylinder of charred paper, no larger than a grain of rice, along with a minuscule speck of blue sealing wax. She did not touch it. Instead, she leaned over slightly, her nose twitching as if taking in the scent of an unfamiliar flower. "How odd," she whispered. "What is it now, Jane?" Dr. Haydock asked, stepping around the telescope stand to join her. "The candle, Doctor," she murmured, pointing a frail finger at the clean white wick. "It has never been lit, yet there is a tiny flake of spent wax on the tray, and the matchbox here has been moved. See how it rests over the faint outline where the dust was wiped away." Inspector Slack marched over, clearly exasperated. "Miss Marple, I must ask you not to interfere with potential." "And look here, Inspector," she interrupted gently, her voice full of mild wonder as she pointed toward the foot of the brass desk leg. "A little scrap of paper. It must have fallen when poor Lord Arthur was tidying his charts." Slack bent down and snatched up the fragment before she could reach for it. It was a torn corner of heavy, cream-colored parchment, no bigger than a postage stamp. On it, written in bold, spidery black ink, were 3 distinct letters: asterisk, 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 Nes, asterisk, 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 followed by a dark, deliberate smudge of blue wax. "Parchment," Slack muttered, staring at the fragment. "Lord Arthur's stationer uses standard woven notepaper. This is legal stock." "Legal parchment," Miss Marple repeated softly, her knitting bag swaying gently against her skirts. "Just like the heavy documents Mr. Vance carries in his leather briefcase, the ones tied with red ribbon." Slack looked from the tiny torn corner to the closed door of the spiral staircase, his mind struggling to reorganize the narrative he had so hastily constructed. Vance? But Vance said the altered trust was never brought out of his bag. "Oh, I am sure Mr. Vance is a most respectable gentleman," Miss Marple said quickly, her face a picture of earnest innocence. "A solicitor would never tell an untruth, would he? Though it is curious that a piece of legal parchment should be burned in a silver tray that has no candle lit upon it, and right beside a telescope that was set up to look at stars through a brass cap." She looked up at the 2 men, her expression serene and entirely devoid of malice. "It makes one think, doesn't it, that someone came up to this room long before the clock struck 12, not to look at the heavens, but to burn a very specific piece of paper before anyone else could read it." The shivering snowstorm outside Starmount Estate showed no sign of abating, sealing the grand manor in a tomb of white. Downstairs in the wood-paneled library, where a bright oak fire snapped in the hearth, Inspector Slack sat behind a massive desk, his pencil tapping rhythmically against his notebook. Gathered before him were the primary figures of the house: Lady Eleanor Sterling, standing tall and motionless as a marble statue; Mr. Thomas Vance, clutching his heavy briefcase to his knees with knuckles as pale as bone; and Mrs. Clara Bantry, who had insisted on staying to offer her moral support and unsolicited opinions. In the corner, sitting in a low plush armchair, Miss Jane Marple quietly unraveled a tangle of lavender wool. Her ears, as always, were tuned to the subtle cadences of deceit. "Now then, Mr. Vance," Inspector Slack began, his voice dropping its previous boastful tone, replaced by the sharp edge of suspicion. "I want to revisit your movement upstairs just before midnight. You told me earlier that you found Lord Arthur dead upon reaching the top of the gallery, and that young Julian had rushed past you." Vance adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. "That is correct, Inspector. I was horrified. I stepped into the room, saw Arthur on the floor, and lost my breath. And yet," Slack said, leaning forward, "we found a fragment of heavy legal parchment, charred at the edge, beside Lord Arthur's desk. Parchment of the exact quality used by your firm, Mr. Vance. Lady Eleanor turned her cold grey eyes upon the solicitor. Thomas, what is the meaning of this? Vance swallowed hard, his throat making a dry click. It is routine draft paper, Inspector. Lord Arthur and I had been discussing estate business earlier in the evening, around 10 o'clock, long before the guests arrived in the observatory. Earlier in the evening? Miss Marple's gentle, quavering voice drifted across the room from her corner. Oh, how very interesting, Mr. Vance. But do forgive a foolish old woman's curiosity. Was that before or after you visited the terrace gardens in your heavy coat? Vance stiffened, his eyes darting toward Miss Marple with a look of sharp alarm. I haven't the slightest idea what you are implying, Miss Marple. I have not been out in the gardens all evening. Oh dear, my mistake entirely, Miss Marple said, offering a fluttering, apologetic smile as her knitting needles clicked softly together. It only occurred to me because when you walked into the drawing room after the tragedy, there was a tiny sprig of winter-blooming jasmine clinging to the turn-up of your trousers. And as dear Mrs. Bantry knows so well, the only winter jasmine on the entire Starmount estate grows along the stone wall right beside the upper terrace ladder. Mrs. Bantry bobbed her head in swift agreement. She's quite right, Slack. I planted that *Jasminum nudiflorum * cutting for Arthur myself 3 autumns ago. It's right under the exterior observatory wall. Inspector Slack stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floorboards. You were on the exterior terrace, Vance, before the murder. This is absurd. Vance snapped, his professional composure cracking at last as a deep flush mounted his cheeks. I am a respected legal officer. I was merely taking the air in a blizzard, Thomas. Lady Eleanor asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Or were you hiding something? I was protecting this family, Vance blurted out, his voice cracking under the sudden weight of eyes upon him. He clutched his leather briefcase even tighter against his chest, as if it contained his very life. Arthur was out of his mind. He was going to ruin everything. Explain yourself, man, Slack commanded. Vance took a shuddering breath, looking defeated. Arthur called me 3 days ago. He had discovered an irregularity in the estate management. A substantial sum, nearly £30,000, had been siphoned from the trust accounts over the last 4 years. A collective gasp echoed through the library. Lady Eleanor's hand flew to her throat, her face draining of what little colour remained. £30,000? Slack repeated. And who had access to those accounts? Lord Arthur believed it was Julian, Vance said rapidly, his words tumbling out like a torrent. That was why he announced he was changing the trust tonight. He intended to strip Julian of his inheritance and place the funds in a public charitable trust. But when I examined the ledgers this evening, I realized the money hadn't been taken by Julian at all. Then who took it? Slack demanded. Vance turned his gaze slowly toward Lady Eleanor. The funds were transferred directly into an overseas holding company controlled by Eleanor's late husband's estate to pay off his gambling debts in Monte Carlo. Arthur didn't know yet. He was going to read the final audit at midnight, publicly ruining his own sister. You liar, Lady Eleanor cried, stepping forward with her eyes blazing. How dare you drag my dead husband's name into this monstrous affair? It is the truth, Eleanor, Vance shouted back. I went up to the terrace earlier to plead with Arthur, to beg him not to read that document tonight. I burnt the draft audit in his silver tray while he was downstairs greeting guests, hoping to buy us time. Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair, watching the fiery confrontation with deep, sorrowful eyes. The secrets were pouring out now, greed, family shame, and desperate cover-ups. Inspector Slack was staring at Vance and Lady Eleanor as though he had suddenly found 2 killers instead of 1. Yet, as Miss Marple looked at the furious solicitor and the proud, broken noblewoman, a soft, persistent doubt tugged at her mind. A man who burns a paper to protect a family reputation is a desperate thief's accomplice, yes. But as she recalled old Mr. Hargreaves from her parish, who had once faked his own ledgers to cover his brother's disgrace, such men usually confessed their folly with tears. They did not stab an old friend in the dark with a heavy brass instrument. The true killer, Miss Marple knew, was still playing a much quieter, far more sinister game. The grand library of Starmount Estate remained thick with tension as Inspector Slack scribbled furious notes, his mind racing to weigh this explosive new financial scandal against the two prominent figures standing before him. "So, Lady Eleanor," Slack said, pointing his pencil accusingly at the pale noblewoman, "you had the ultimate motive to silence your brother before he publicly exposed your late husband's debts and disgraced your family name." "I knew nothing of any transfers," Lady Eleanor declared, her voice trembling with rigid outrage. "Thomas Vance managed those accounts. If £30,000 went missing, look to the solicitor who held the power of attorney, not to a grieving sister." Before Slack could press further, the double doors of the library burst open. Constable Hicks stood in the doorway, his uniform drenched in melting snow, his chest heaving as if he had run a mile. "Inspector," Hicks gasped, gripping the doorframe. It's downstairs in the cellar, sir. You'd better come quickly." Slack frowned, exasperated by the interruption. "What on earth are you on about, Hicks? I am in the middle of a vital interrogation." "It's the groundskeeper, sir, old Gregory," Hicks stammered, pointing a shaking hand down the corridor. "I went down to fetch extra coal for the morning room fire, and I found him lying near the furnace. He's been struck down, sir. He's barely breathing." A sharp murmur of horror rippled through the room. Mrs. Bantry clutched her pearl necklace, while Lady Eleanor sank heavily into a high-backed mahogany chair. Miss Marple did not utter a sound. She rose from her armchair with surprising swiftness, her pink wool shawl draped neatly over her arms, and followed close behind Dr. Haydock as Inspector Slack and Constable Hicks rushed down the stone basement steps. The estate cellar was damp, cold, and smelled heavily of damp earth and anthracite coal. Near the glowing iron door of the roaring furnace lay Gregory, the elderly Starmount groundskeeper, his grey head propped against a pile of burlap sacks. Dr. Haydock immediately dropped to his knees beside the unconscious man, opening his medical bag. "He's alive," Haydock announced after a tense moment, examining a dark, bruising lump near the old man's temple. "Concussed by a heavy blow, but his skull isn't fractured. He was struck from behind." "What was he doing down here?" Slack demanded, shining his heavy brass torch around the shadowy basement. "And who attacked him?" Look here, Inspector," Miss Marple said softly. She had stepped past the huddle of men and was standing near an old wooden workbench set against the damp stone wall. Cluttered upon the bench were Gregory's gardening tools, oil cans, and a half-empty box of iron nails. But what held Miss Marple's keen attention was a freshly opened wooden crate resting on the floor beneath the bench, its heavy iron lid forced open with a crowbar. "What is that box?" Slack asked, striding over and peering into the pine crate. Inside lay rows of straw packing material, but the contents were gone, save for a single heavy brass fitting that matched the exact metalwork of the observatory's grand telescope. "It's a spare alignment kit," Dr. Haydock said, looking up from Gregory. "Arthur ordered a duplicate set of brass fixtures from London 3 weeks ago for the restoration. He told me he kept them locked down here until the observatory work was complete." "The plumb bob," Miss Marple murmured, her blue eyes shining with a sudden icy clarity. "The duplicate brass plumb bob." "Malay," Slack blinked, his mouth dropping open slightly. "Duplicate? What are you saying, Miss Marple?" "Oh, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice filled with a gentle, profound sadness. "The weapon upstairs, the heavy brass plumb bob driven into poor Lord Arthur's heart. Everyone assumed the killer snatched it from the telescope table during a sudden violent argument at midnight." She pointed a delicate finger toward the empty straw lining of the crate. "But the real plumb bob belonging to the grand telescope was never moved at all. The killer did not act on impulse tonight. Someone came down into this dark cellar hours ago, forced open this crate, and carried a second identical brass instrument upstairs hidden beneath their coat, fully intending to commit a deliberate, cold-blooded murder." Inspector Slack stared at the empty crate, his confident theory of an impulsive spat over a trust fund crumbling into dust. "And old Gregory. Poor Gregory must have come down to tend the furnace, seen someone tampering with the crate, or perhaps recognized who was down here and was struck down to keep him silent," Miss Marple explained gently. She turned her gaze toward the cold stone steps leading back up to the warmth of the estate. "You see, Inspector, we have been looking at this terrible tragedy all wrong. This was not a sudden burst of rage by a desperate nephew, nor was it a quick panic by a worried solicitor trying to hide a document." "Then what was it?" Slack asked, his voice stripped of all its former arrogance. Miss Marple adjusted her lace cap, her face grave and deeply thoughtful. "It was a carefully staged theatrical performance, Inspector. A masterpiece of deception where every single person in this house was given a specific role to play without ever realizing it. The killer wanted us to look at trusts, wills, and family quarrels, because as long as we were arguing about money, no one would notice the simple, terrifying truth of why Lord Arthur really had to die tonight." The cold basement draft carried the acrid smell of coal smoke up the stone stairs, mingling with the heavy, tense atmosphere of the main hallway. Inspector Slack paced the length of the oriental rug, his confidence entirely shaken. The discovery of the second brass plumb bob in the basement had destroyed his neat, hasty theory. If Gregory survives," Dr. Haydock said, stepping out of the morning room where the old groundskeeper had been laid upon a sofa, "he may be able to tell us who struck him, but for now he remains unconscious." "Which leaves us back at square one," Slack grumbled, running a tired hand through his thinning hair. "A house full of suspects, 2 hidden motives, and a killer who planned this days in advance." Miss Jane Marple sat quietly on a velvet bench near the grand staircase, her pink shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. Her knitting needles were still, resting in her lap. Her sharp blue eyes watched the remaining guests who had gathered in the hall. Julian, pale and anxious, guarded by Constable Hicks. Lady Eleanor, standing aloof by the grand clock. Mr. Vance, nervously wiping his spectacles, and Mrs. Bantry, who was whispering frantically to the vicar's sister. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was a fascinating and terrible thing. When a grand illusion is performed on a stage, the magician relies entirely on directing the audience's attention to the wrong hand. In St. Mary Mead, old Mr. Harbottle had once convinced the entire parish that his brother had stolen his prize-winning marrows, simply by making a tremendous fuss about a broken fence post, while he had actually sold the vegetables himself to a hotel in Bournemouth. The killer in this house had staged a similar grand performance. Miss Marple rose slowly from her bench. Her movements were delicate, almost fragile, as she smoothed her skirts and drifted toward the heavy mahogany table where the guests had left their coats and evening accessories upon arriving hours ago. "Inspector," Miss Marple cooed softly, her voice carrying a note of timid hesitation. "Do forgive me for troubling you when you are so very busy with your official duties." Slack stopped pacing and sighed, though his tone was noticeably less abrasive than before. "What is it now, Miss Marple?" "Well," she began, her fingers fluttering near her lace collar, "I was just thinking about poor Lord Arthur's speech from the podium before he went upstairs. He was such a dramatic gentleman, was he not? He loved the theatre of it all, he said. We look not merely at the heavens, but into the future. It sounded so very grand." Yes, Slack said impatiently. "He was announcing his intention to alter the estate trust." "Was he, Inspector?" Miss Marple asked, her watery blue eyes widening in mild, innocent inquiry. "Or was he simply reciting something he had read earlier?" She reached out a frail, liver-spotted hand toward a thick, leather-bound volume that lay half-hidden beneath Mr. Vance's heavy winter overcoat on the side table. It was a guest book and diary Lord Arthur kept in the vestibule. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "Lord Arthur was a man of precise habits. Whenever he prepared a public speech for the village astronomical society, he always wrote a complete draft in his daily journal first. My late Uncle Henry was just the same. He could never preach a sermon without writing it down 3 days prior and reciting it to his sister's canary." Inspector Slack stepped closer, his interest piqued. "Are you saying his speech was written in that book?" "I am merely wondering," Miss Marple said softly, "why anyone would feel the need to tear out the last 3 pages of a journal written only yesterday." Slack instantly snatched the book from the table and flipped it open. The binding was visible where 3 heavy parchment leaves had been neatly, methodically sliced away with a sharp blade near the spine. A sudden, sharp intake of breath sounded from across the hall. Miss Marple did not look at the book in Slack's hands. Her gaze was fixed entirely upon the faces of the gathered crowd. She watched the subtle, microscopic reactions that ordinary people could never quite hide when caught unawares. The quick tighten of a jaw, the sudden shift of weight, the momentary freeze of a breathing chest. Julian looked merely puzzled. Lady Eleanor frowned in cold disdain. Mr. Vance blinked behind his spectacles, looking bewildered. But near the edge of the fireplace stood Mrs. Clara Bantry's quiet companion for the evening, Mr. Christopher Giles, the young local archivist whom Lord Arthur had hired 3 months ago to catalogue the ancient historical manuscripts in the Starmount Library. Giles had been sitting quietly in the background all night, taking notes for the local newspaper, virtually invisible to the police and guests alike. At the mention of the torn journal pages, Giles's hand twitched inside his coat pocket. A tiny, fleeting shadow of cold, calculating calculation passed across his pleasant, ordinary features before vanishing behind a mask of mild curiosity. It was a reaction no larger than the flutter of a moth's wing, but to Miss Marple, who had spent 70 years observing the small human tragedies of a quiet English village, it was as loud as a thunderclap. "How very peculiar," Miss Marple murmured, taking a small step toward the young archivist, her face a picture of innocent grandmotherly concern. "Mr. Giles, dear, you look terribly cold. You are shivering so. Did you drop something near the hearth?" Giles stiffened, his fingers tightening within his pocket. No, Miss Marple. I am quite fine, thank you. Merely shaken by these dreadful events." Of course, Miss Marple said gently, her voice dripping with warm, disarming sympathy. "It is so hard for young people when tragedy strikes, just like poor Tommy Noakes when the blacksmith's shop caught fire. Everyone thought Tommy was trying to put out the flames, but he was actually trying to reach his stolen pocket watch before the wooden bench burned away." She smiled up at Giles, a sweet, helpless old woman's smile that hid a blade of pure, uncompromising steel. The psychological trap had been set. Now, Miss Marple needed only to wait for the killer to make the final, fatal mistake. The grand hall fell into an expectant, suffocating hush. Outside, the blizzard howled against the stained glass windows of Starmount Estate. But inside, all eyes shifted from Inspector Slack to the small, frail woman standing near the hearth. Miss Jane Marple stood serenely, her pink wool shawl tucked neatly over her arms. She looked like nothing more than a harmless elderly spinster who had lost her way on her home to tea. Yet, as she looked at Christopher Giles, her blue eyes held a calm, terrifying certainty. "Miss Marple," Inspector Slack snapped, his patience frayed to a thread. "What on earth does a stolen pocket watch in St. Mary Mead have to do with Lord Arthur Stirling's murder?" "Everything, Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, turning her gentle gaze toward the detective. "Or rather, it has everything to do with how easily we are fooled when we look only at what someone * wants * us to see." She walked slowly toward the center of the hall, her soft slippers making no sound upon the Persian rugs. "Tonight, we were presented with a very neat, very theatrical tragedy. We were meant to see a greedy nephew, a nervous solicitor, and a missing £30,000. We were meant to believe that Lord Arthur was struck down at midnight in a sudden violent dispute over an altered trust. And wasn't he?" Slack blurted, gesturing toward the stairs. "Vance admitted burning the paper. Julian had no alibi. Mr. Vance burnt a document to cover his own professional negligence," Miss Marple explained patiently, as if guiding a child through a simple sums lesson. "And poor Julian was merely throwing a temper because he is young, foolish, and hopelessly in debt. Neither of them killed Lord Arthur. In fact, Lord Arthur was already dead, long before the clock struck 12. A violent gasp went up from the gathered guests. Lady Eleanor gripped the back of a chair, her face turning chalk white. "Dead before midnight. But we heard him. He spoke to us from the podium at 11:30. "You heard a man standing in the shadows of the podium, Lady Eleanor," Miss Marple corrected gently. "A man wearing Lord Arthur's distinctive velvet smoking jacket, reading words that Lord Arthur had written in his journal days prior, words that were later torn out of that book so no one could compare the handwriting." She turned her head slowly, fixing her sharp gaze directly upon Christopher Giles. "Isn't that right, Mr. Giles?" Giles took a step back, his face draining of all color. "This is absurd. I am an archivist, a guest. I was standing in the hall all evening taking notes for the local gazette." "You were hired 3 months ago to catalogue the Starmount Library," Miss Marple said, her voice dropping into a tone of quiet, unyielding authority. "An archivist with an expert knowledge of ancient manuscripts and an even greater knowledge of their value on the black market in London." "Miss Marple, explain yourself," Slack demanded, stepping between Giles and the door. "Lord Arthur did not discover a financial irregularity in his bank accounts, Inspector," Miss Marple said. "He discovered that 3 priceless 15th century astronomical folios, the crown jewels of the Starmount collection, had been systematically stolen and replaced with brilliant, meticulous forgeries." She pointed a frail finger toward Giles. "Mr." Giles was the only person with complete, unmonitored access to the rare vault. When Lord Arthur realized the theft yesterday morning, he did not call the police immediately. Being an eccentric, proud man, he noted it in his journal and confronted his archivist privately. Giles's lip trembled, his calm facade fracturing into terror. "You have no proof of this monstrous libel." "Oh, but human nature provides the proof, Mr. Giles," Miss Marple said with a mournful sigh. "A murderer always plans the crime, but he rarely plans the small, ordinary things that follow. You needed Lord Arthur dead before he could expose you publicly at his grand unveiling. So you acted with cold, deliberate calculation." She began counting the clues on her delicate, liver-spotted fingers. "First, you went down to the basement hours before the party, forced open the crate, and stole the spare brass plumb bob. You hid it in your overcoat. Second, you struck poor Gregory down when he nearly caught you near the furnace. Third, you lured Lord Arthur up to the freezing observation gallery early in the evening under the pretense of adjusting the telescope's lenses. There, in the dark, you struck him down with the heavy brass tool from below." "But the speech," Mrs. Bantry cried out. "We all saw Lord Arthur at 11:30. You saw Mr. Giles in Lord Arthur's velvet jacket," Miss Marple revealed smoothly. "The gallery was kept dim by design. He stood on the raised podium, recited the speech Lord Arthur had written in his journal, and told everyone the host would remain upstairs until midnight. He then slipped up the spiral stairs, placed the body beside the telescope, left the velvet jacket on his victim, and used the small terrace door to escape outside, leaving the ladder marks in the snow that I observed earlier." Miss Marple looked at Giles with deep sorrow. "You climbed down the ladder, re-entered through the conservatory, put on your own coat, and joined the guests downstairs just in time to watch the clock strike 12. You knew that when the body was found, everyone would assume the murder happened at midnight, giving you an absolute unbreakable alibi among 50 witnesses." "It's a lie," Giles shrieked, his voice rising to a frantic, hysterical pitch. "It's all wild speculation. You can't prove a single word." "I do not need to prove it, Mr. Giles," Miss Marple said softly, stepping closer to him, "because when you went back upstairs in the dark to retrieve the torn pages of the journal you had left on the desk, you caught your coat sleeve on the rough iron latch of the terrace door. And if Inspector Slack examines the right-hand pocket of your tweed jacket this very second, he will find the missing pages, along with the blue wax seal of the Starmount vault." Giles gasped, his hand flying instinctively toward his coat pocket to protect the evidence. In that single desperate gesture, his guilt was laid bare for all the world to see. Inspector Slack did not hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbed Giles by the lapels, and dragged the heavy, torn parchment leaves directly out of the archivist's pocket, holding them high in the light of the chandelier. "Christopher Giles," Slack bellowed, clicking a pair of iron handcuffs over the young man's wrists. "I am arresting you for the willful murder of Lord Arthur Stirling." The heavy iron handcuffs clicked shut around Christopher Giles's wrists with a cold, definitive finality, echoing sharply through the grand hall of Starmount Estate. The young archivist, his previous composure entirely shattered, sagged between Constable Hicks and Inspector Slack, his eyes fixed on the floorboards in silent defeat. "Get him down to the holding cells," Inspector Slack ordered, his voice carrying a mix of grim satisfaction and faint embarrassment. He adjusted his coat, turning to face the quiet woman in the fluffy pink wool shawl. "Well, Miss Marple, I must admit your unconventional methods have proven remarkably effective. The county chief will hear of your assistance in this matter." Miss Marple offered a small, self-deprecating fluttering of her hands. "Oh, Inspector, you are far too kind to a foolish old woman. It was your quick action with the handcuffs that truly saved the day. I merely noticed the little things, the sort of silly details one learns from watching life in a small village." The constables led the trembling killer out into the howling white night, the heavy front doors shutting behind them and sealing out the bitter winter storm. With the primary tragedy concluded, the heavy air of suspicion that had choked the estate began to clear, leaving behind a profound, weary silence. Lady Eleanor Sterling sat quietly by the dying embers of the hearth, her icy posture softened by exhaustion. Across the room, Julian Sterling stood near his uncle's desk, staring down at the polished mahogany with a look of quiet, mournful regret. "I can hardly believe it," Julian murmured softly, stepping toward Miss Marple. "Poor Uncle Arthur, murdered for a few old books, and I spent the entire evening raging about a trust fund. Money and pride, my dear boy, are very distracting things," Miss Marple said gently, resting a frail, comforting hand on his sleeve. "They make us blind to what is truly happening right before our eyes. Your uncle was an eccentric man, yes, but he cared deeply for this house and its treasures. You would do well to honor his memory by taking better care of your own affairs from now on." Julian nodded slowly, a look of genuine humility crossing his face. "I will, Miss Marple. I swear I will." Meanwhile, Mr. Thomas Vance approached Lady Eleanor, holding out his hands in a gesture of sincere apology. "Eleanor, I am deeply sorry for my panic earlier. I should have trusted the truth rather than attempting to hide the estate ledgers. I shall resign my position as solicitor first thing in the morning." Lady Eleanor looked up, her expression tired but remarkably calm. "No, Thomas. You acted out of a misplaced desire to protect my family's pride. It was foolish, but not malicious. We shall sort out the accounts together in the light of day. Ahaidamayma." Clara Bantry bustled over to Miss Marple, wrapping her thick woolen cloak tightly around her shoulders. "Well, Jane," Mrs. Bantry declared, shaking her head in sheer marvel, "I must say, when you started talking about Willie Higgins and the blacksmith's anvil, I thought you had completely lost your senses. How on earth did you realize the speech was fake?" Miss Marple smiled gently, her blue eyes twinkling under the warm light of the chandelier. "It was the lens cap, Clara dear. Lord Arthur was a passionate astronomer. A man who loves his craft would never stand beside a grand telescope with the brass covers still fitted over the eyepieces while preparing to observe the stars. It was like old Mr. Pringle trying to play the church organ without opening the keyboard lid. It showed immediately that the person standing at the podium had no idea how the instrument actually worked." Dr. Haydock walked over, carrying his black medical bag, a faint, dry smile playing upon his lips. "And what about poor Gregory downstairs, Jane? How did you know he was struck by the second plumb bob?" "Because of human nature, Doctor," Miss Marple replied, taking up her embroidered work bag from the side table and settling her slate-blue knitting inside. "When someone decides to commit a terrible crime, they almost always double their preparations out of fear. A clever man like Mr. Giles would never risk stealing the actual measuring tool from the telescope during a crowded party. Someone might have seen him. He needed an identical piece beforehand. It was the only logical reason for a locked crate in the cellar to be forced open on the very same night." Dr. Haydock shook his head, chuckling softly. "You never cease to amaze me, Jane. Little Paddocks owes you a great debt." "Oh, nonsense," Miss Marple cooed, adjusting her lace cap. "Human nature is the same everywhere, whether in a grand Victorian manor or a small cottage in St. Mary Mead. People are driven by the same sad, familiar weaknesses, greed, vanity, and the foolish hope that they can deceive others forever. One has only to observe quietly to see the truth." The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 2 in the morning, its deep tones echoing through the quiet manor. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to subside, leaving the frozen grounds of Starmount wrapped in a serene, unbroken silence. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the wide front bay window, looking out into the pale, moonlit white garden. The wicked deed had been exposed, the innocent cleared, and justice would take its rightful course. Yet, as she looked out over the cold, still village, her gentle face held a tinge of quiet sadness for the frailties of the human heart. Wrapping her fluffy pink wool shawl more tightly around her shoulders, Miss Jane Marple turned back toward the warmth of the hearth, ready to return to her peaceful, ordinary life, until human nature, as it so inevitably did, should call upon her once again. The dawn broke over Starmount Estate with a brittle, crystalline brilliance. The howling blizzard of the night had vanished, leaving the village of little paddocks buried under a pristine blanket of white that sparkled beneath a pale winter sun. Inside the grand manor, the heavy curtains of the morning room were drawn back, allowing the sharp, cold light to flood the high-ceilinged room where a log fire crackled steadily in the hearth. Though the killer was locked securely in a cell at county headquarters, the house remained suspended in that strange, hollow quiet that always follows a sudden violence. Miss Jane Marple sat comfortably in a high-backed armchair beside the window, a cup of hot Lapsang souchong tea resting on a small mahogany table beside her. Her fluffy pink wool shawl was draped neatly over her shoulders, and her fingers moved with familiar, rhythmic grace over a new ball of soft lavender yarn. Across the room, Dr. Haydock stood leaning against the mantelpiece, warming his hands, while Mrs. Clara Bantry paced the oriental carpet with energetic restlessness. "I still cannot get over the sheer cold-bloodedness of it all, Jane," Mrs. Bantry declared, pausing to adjust a vase of dried winter flora on the sideboard. "That young man, Giles, sat right beside us during the cider toast. He smiled at my little joke about the dahlias. To think a murderer was eating cucumber sandwiches in our midst. Cruelty, Clara dear, so often wears the most pleasant and ordinary face," Miss Marple said softly, her blue eyes reflecting the quiet light of the fire. "It is one of the most tragic aspects of human nature. The most dangerous people are rarely the ones who shout or look villainous. They are usually the quiet, polite ones who believe they are far too clever to ever be caught. Like young Peter Simpson back in 22, Dr. Haydock remarked with a dry smile, taking a sip of his black coffee. "The curate's clerk, who spent 3 years complimenting the bishop's roses while systematically forging the parish land deeds." "Precisely, Doctor," Miss Marple agreed, nodding gently. "Poor Peter was always so helpful with the Sunday school picnics, but he had allowed his vanity to convince him that his intellect elevated him above the moral laws that governed ordinary folks. Mr. Giles suffered from the exact same affliction. He saw Lord Arthur not as a kindly patron who had given him employment, but merely as an old man standing between him and a fortune in stolen medieval manuscripts." The heavy oak door of the morning room opened softly, and Lady Eleanor Sterling stepped inside. She had discarded her formal evening gown for a simple, severe dress of dark grey wool. Though her face still bore the pale, drawn lines of grief and exhaustion, the cold, defensive edge that had marked her demeanor during the investigation had softened. "Good morning, Lady Eleanor," Miss Marple said warmly, setting her knitting needles into her lap. "I hope you managed to secure a few hours of rest." "A little, thank you, Miss Marple," Lady Eleanor replied, walking slowly toward the hearth. She looked at the old woman with a mixture of deep gratitude and lingering awe. "I came to tell you that Dr. Haydock's prognosis for Gregory was correct. The hospital phoned 10 minutes ago. The poor man has regained consciousness and remembers seeing Giles near the basement crate. He will make a full recovery." "Oh, what wonderful news," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, clapping her hands together. "A true blessing." "Indeed," Lady Eleanor said softly. She turned directly to Miss Marple, her grey eyes clear and steady. "I also wanted to express what I could not say last night amid the dreadful panic. If you had not been here, Miss Marple, if you had not possessed the wisdom to look past our foolish family squabbles, an innocent young man would be sitting in a police cell today, and my brother's murderer would have walked away free." "My dear Lady Eleanor," Miss Marple cooed, her hands fluttering in mild embarrassment, "you must not make too much of it. Inspector Slack is a very energetic policeman, though he does tend to run a bit ahead of his own horse, so to speak. He would have arrived at the truth eventually." "Inspector Slack," Dr. Haydock snorted quietly into his coffee cup, "would currently be drafting a press release about Julian's confession if you hadn't practically held his nose to the evidence, Jane." A faint, fleeting smile touched Lady Eleanor's lips, the first true smile to cross her face since the tragedy began. "Perhaps. But it was your kindness, Miss Marple, that spared Julian from a terrible injustice. He is upstairs now, writing letters of apology to the trust officers. This dreadful business has shaken him out of his foolishness. He means to take his responsibilities at Starmount seriously now. Responsibility is a very good medicine for headstrong young men, Miss Marple observed gently, taking up her lavender wool once more. It reminds me so much of young Tommy Netley. After his uncle's hay barn caught fire, he stopped betting on the pony races entirely and became a most respectable churchwarden. Lady Eleanor gave a quiet nod, walking toward the window to look out over the sunlit, snowy grounds. The estate will be quiet now. The observatory dome will be closed until spring. But at least Arthur's memory is clear. He died protecting the treasures he loved. And that, my dear, Miss Marple said softly, is a far better legacy than any amount of gold or trust funds. As Lady Eleanor left the room to join her nephew, Mrs. Bantry walked over to Miss Marple's chair, peering down at the steady, rhythmic movement of the knitting needles. "Well, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said, a mischievous spark returning to her eye. "Now that the killer is caught, the innocent cleared, and Starmount saved, I suppose you'll be returning to your quiet garden in St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple looked up, her watery blue eyes twinkling with gentle humor as she adjusted her fluffy pink shawl. "Oh yes, Clara dear. My winter cabbage requires attention, and I am quite behind on my socks for the parish bazaar. Life in the village is always so full of quiet little duties." "Quiet?" Dr. Haydock laughed, shaking his head. "Until another wicked mind forgets that Jane Marple is watching." The afternoon sun cast long, amber shadows across the snow-covered lane leading out of Starmount Estate. The air was crisp, clear, and carried the sharp, sweet scent of burning wood from the chimneys of little paddocks. The severe winter storm had completely given way to a tranquil, pale blue sky, leaving the village wrapped in an idyllic, peaceful hush, as though the dark, violent events of the previous night had been nothing more than a passing bad dream. Standing near the wrought-iron gates of the estate, Dr. Haydock stood beside his black motor car, helping Miss Jane Marple place her small leather overnight case into the luggage compartment. Mrs. Clara Bantry stood nearby, wrapped in an opulent fox fur coat, watching her old friend with fond admiration. "It is extraordinary, Jane," Mrs. Bantry remarked, pulling her gloves snug over her fingers. "To look at the observatory dome resting so quietly against the sky now. One would never imagine that hours ago it was the scene of such a terrible drama. The village is already talking, of course. Mrs. Spender at the post office assured me that Giles looked decidedly suspicious when he bought a dozen penny stamps 3 weeks ago." Miss Marple offered a gentle, sorrowful smile, settling her fluffy pink wool shawl around her chin as the cold breeze rustled the hem of her coat. "Poor Mrs. Spender. She always sees the shadow of the gallows after the rope has already been tied, dear Clara. It is human nature, I suppose, to want to believe we knew the truth all along. It makes us feel so much safer in a world that can be terribly unpredictable." "And are we safe, Jane?" Dr. Haydock asked softly, closing the boot of the car with a solid thud and looking down at her. "In St. Mary Mead, in little paddocks, or anywhere else. When a young man of culture and education can strike down an old friend for a handful of dusty parchment, it makes one wonder if civilization is merely a very thin varnish." Miss Marple looked out over the glittering, snowbound landscape, her watery blue eyes reflecting a deep, ancient wisdom. She reached into her embroidered work bag, her fingers resting lightly on her half-finished lavender wool sock. "Civilization is a varnish, Doctor," she agreed quietly, her voice steady and clear against the winter chill. "And human nature is a very old, very complex piece of wood beneath it. People believe that dreadful crimes are born out of extraordinary, unusual monstrousness, but they almost never are. They come from the most ordinary, pathetic little seeds: vanity, impatience, the petty desire to have more than one's neighbor, and above all, the foolish belief that one is clever enough to escape the consequences of one's actions." "Like young Christopher Giles," Mrs. Bantry mused, shaking her head. "He had talent, a good position, the respect of the parish, and he threw it all away. He allowed himself to believe that his own desires were more important than the truth," Miss Marple said. "It is the very same flaw that led poor little Emily Higgins to take the velvet ribbon from the vicarage bazaar back in '04. She didn't think of herself as a thief, you see. She simply thought she deserved to look pretty more than the bazaar committee deserved the sixpence. Once a person convinces themselves of their own special importance, the step from a small deceit to a terrible tragedy is remarkably short. Dr. Haydock opened the passenger door of the motorcar, offering his hand to assist her inside. "Well, Jane, whatever the dark corners of the human heart may hold, I am simply glad you were here to shine a light into this one." Inspector Slack took all the official credit in his report to the chief constable, of course. He mentioned shrewd police deduction 3 times in his statement to the press. Miss Marple chuckled softly, a sound like dry leaves rustling in an autumn breeze, as she settled onto the warm leather seat. "Oh, dear Inspector Slack, I am so glad he feels satisfied. A detective must have his official triumphs, Doctor. It is much better for everyone if an old woman is thought of merely as a foolish, rambling chatterbox who happens to be underfoot. It allows one to observe things so much more clearly when people forget you are there." Bantry leaned through the car window, patting Miss Marple's gloved hand warmly. "You won't be forgotten in Little Paddocks, Jane. Lady Eleanor told me this morning that she intends to donate Lord Arthur's duplicate telescope fixtures to the local schoolhouse in your honor." "Oh, how very practical." Miss Marple beamed, her eyes sparkling with genuine pleasure. "The children will derive such joy from looking at the moon. Science is a wonderful thing, Clara, so long as one remembers that the stars above us follow exact, unyielding laws, just as human lives do." Haydock walked around to the driver's side, cranked the engine into a steady, rumbling purr, and climbed behind the wheel. The motor car began to roll slowly down the snow-cleared lane, leaving Starmount Estate and its dark, untangled secrets behind in the sparkling afternoon light. Miss Marple leaned back against the headrest, looking out at the passing hedgerows draped in white. Her delicate hands smoothed the soft yarn in her lap, her mind already drifting away from the cold observatory, the heavy brass tools, and the tragic vanity of Christopher Giles. Ahead of her lay the familiar, quiet roads returning to St. Mary Mead, to her modest cottage, her cozy parlor, her winter cabbage patch, and the gentle, predictable rhythms of home. She knew, with the quiet certainty of her 70 years, that peace had returned to Little Paddocks. But she knew also, with a gentle, patient sadness, that as long as men and women walked the earth, human nature would always provide another puzzle for a quiet old lady knitting by the fire.